The Truth About Outpost 4, January 23rd, 2004. I'd always wondered why we had Outpost 4. It was so unnecessary, so extra. Situated on a ridge overlooking to the south, the empty plain surveyed by the rest of the outpost, and to the north, an empty plain stretched beyond our scientific jurisdiction. The weather satellites were only directed towards the areas we already had data on. Of course, I'm still rather far from knowing the truth on the matter, but, well, you see, this all began no more than a few weeks ago, on a day no different from any other. I live in an Arctic research facility several hundred miles north of Russia, along with 4 other researchers. My name is Evelyn White, and I'm a meteorologist, the American representative of a 4-year expedition. The others are Laila Vasilievna from Russia, Ray Morris from England, and Abdul Aziz Al Musa from India. Oh, and Kato Yoshino from Japan. As far as languages went, Ray, Abdul and I fluently spoke English. Kate spoke a little of it, and Laila didn't know any at all, though Ray knew some Russian to act as a translator. Our facility, jointly funded by our governments, consisted of 4 outposts, numbered by the distance from the headquarters, where our living spaces and amenities were located. We have been here for a little under a year now, and I remember when the expedition was first announced. It was pretty shocking to the world. 5 countries willing to put aside the political differences in the name of science. It was actually pretty interesting. The early days were a bit rough. Some translation issues, some initial tensions, but we quickly realized we were going to have to get along. Internet was spotted when it was there at all. Radios were the same, and there were only so many times you could reread a few books in the Outpost library before you started to go insane. By January 23rd of the 2nd year, though we had a rhythm, we became friends and it showed in a workflow. There had been storms on occasion. Of course there would. It's the Arctic. They'd usually strand us whenever we were at the time, but they usually only lasted a few hours before it was safe to move. And when they didn't, we usually had ample time to get where we wanted to be. January 3rd, though, was different. It was a clear day, and it was during one of the few hours of sunlight we got that time of year. I had been out in Outpost 4 with Kada. Data had been coming in slightly skewed from the sensors, so we decided to hear out and see if we could fix anything. Everything on the outside had looked normal upon inspection, so we moved inside to look at the receivers, and, unbeknownst to us, the clouds came. It wasn't until the heating coils began to activate that we looked outside and saw that it had turned dark as night, and the first flurries of snow were just beginning to whip down. Not yet strong enough to make a noise against the wind now, but well on its way to become a blizzard. I let out a curse, making my way to my feet and peering into the storm. "Looks like we're gonna be stuck in here," I said, and Kada nodded, joining me. "Are the radios out?" Kada asked. Why didn't the others warn us? Maybe these sensors are more messed up than we thought, I replied, as the storm seemed to exponentially increase in intensity. The skies continued to darken. I let out a whistle and emanated my original statement. Looks like we're going to be here for a while. Now, each post was stocked with 3 days worth of ration for 5 people to prevent a Donna party scenario if we all got trapped in the same outpost for an extended period of time. So I wasn't worried about survival, but I mean, there are 2 rooms in the outpost. Not counting airlocks, it's not exactly a 2-bed 3-bath. There was an observatory, a fairly small room with a dome of glass facing out into the tundra, and behind it, a slightly larger room dedicated to the display of the readings collected at site, along with some machinery. It was around 2 o'clock in the afternoon when the storm hit, so with a good chunk of time to burn before sleep would deprive us of need of interaction. And I have a feeling both of us knew it. Come on, let's hang out in the observatory, I suggested, waving Kata over, so we can enjoy the stunning views of snow on the ground, and if you get bored of that, there's snow in the sky too. Kata let out a half-hearted laugh, leaning up against the wall and sliding to the ground. I did the same on the other side of the door. The heating coils were beginning to do their job, and, on the other hand, metal floor we sat on, it wasn't terribly uncomfortable. I hope Ray and Lila got back in time, I mused, talking more to fill the silence than to say anything meaningful. Weren't they out in Sector 9? What were they doing there anyway? When mapping out this research facility, the best and brightest of 5 whole countries got together and came up with just about the worst possible way to get around. They divided a 4x2 and 2/3 mile area into 16 sectors, labeled horizontally, with one being at point over a few miles northwest of the headquarters, where nothing was, and 16 being a point 2 miles south of the headquarters, also where nothing was. I suppose it's properly oriented, but it gets to be a hassle. Oh, right. Remember those strange energy signatures we picked up a few weeks ago? Kata asked, and I nodded. They went out to check them out in a snowmobile. They should be fine. If anything, they're probably... She gave me a worried look, hoping I filled in the blank on my own, which I did, but there wasn't much in the way of entertainment out there. What? They're probably what? You know what I mean, she said, blushing. The 2 of them? Out alone? It's probably very dangerous, I replied. No, I mean they're probably... She trailed off once more before finally deciding on... They're probably creating their own heath. Ray and Lila had been a topic of some interest among the 3 others, and there had seemed to be a certain spark between them that went further than the fact that they spoke both Russian. Though with the lack of gossip out there, that alone could have turned into a scandal given time. I was sure that, whatever Abdul was, if he wasn't pacing around, terrified that we were all going to die and leave him alone in the blizzard, he was bursting at the seams, ready to talk about Ray and Lila's alone time. Kada, are you insinuating romance? I asked. Oh, surely the flame of that passion shall burn right through the quench of Arctic cold, will it not? Stop it, she said, her blushing continuing. I didn't say that, you're putting words in my mouth. Look at us, gossiping the blizzard away, I said. Feels like we're teenagers all over again, doesn't it? Kada let out another laugh before we ended with a long sigh. You know, sometimes I wonder if they even do have feelings for each other. Or if they just lead us on, to give us something to talk about. I cocked my head, thinking about it for a moment, then nodded. Pretty profound good on you. I'm going to forget you ever said anything, since we still need something to gossip about, but profound nonetheless. For the next few hours, as the sun began to set, we talked about sparingly, and it was, on a whole, rather boring. It wasn't until we started to get ready to spend the night in the Outpost that the first major event of the consequence occurred. As the blizzard raged outside, we began to lay out our sleeping bags and settle in for the night. As we were setting up, at one point, we both froze simultaneously. In the distance, in a faint white of a motor, had just begun. That's not, I said. It can't be, Kada replied. They wouldn't come out in a storm, I said, nodding. But the whine grew. It grew and grew until it finally... It came to a stop of Outpost 4. Kate and I suddenly stood up and made our way to the door. We paused, waiting for something to happen. Then there was a series of loud bangs on the door, outside of the airlock, and a faint yell of the howling wind. We have to let them in, Kada said. Of course, I nodded, flipping the switch to the left door, which released a hatch outside of the airlock. Through the window to the interior, we watched Lila and Ray pile into a small space, bundled up in the Arctic wear, and after a moment, Ray yanked off his goggles and pulled down the scarf he had been wrapped around his head. Plastered across his face was an expression of the uttermost complete fear, and he locked eyes with me, approaching the window. When his forehead bumped up against the glass, he pressed his hand next to it and said 4 of the most terrifying words in the Arctic researcher can hear. There's something out there. After Lila closed the door on the outside, I quickly opened the interior door, and they both collapsed in. What do you mean? I asked, supporting Ray as he fell forwards, panting. These things. They're out wandering around the tundra. We saw them in Sector 9, but they could be anywhere. Okay, slow down, I said, holding him by the shoulders. Let's get you two warmed up. You probably just got scared by a storm. He continued to shake his head as Kate and I wrapped him in our blankets and helped him sit down. And after Kate had pressed a bottle of water into Ray's hand, we sat back. Alright, tell us what you saw, Kate said. Ray took a deep breath, steadying some of his nerves, and slowly began to speak. It happened around 2, he said. We left around 1:30. We were going to check out those weird energy signatures we picked up on earlier. They were starting to fade, so we were in a bit of a rush. But we'd honored it down to a location about half a mile away from the ridge of the hills, around the middle of the sector. By the time we got to the hills, the storm was beginning to brew. But like I said, the signatures were fading, and we figured we still had at least half an hour before the storm got dangerous. So we pushed on. Getting up on the hill, the sky was darkening. It was much quicker than usual, but we were so close, so we kept pushing on. And as soon as we hit the top of the hill, we saw what was causing the signatures. They had to be it. There's no other explanation. What were they? I asked as he passed. These massive creatures. They looked like trees at first, and that's what I thought they were, until I remembered where I was. They had to have been at least 50 feet tall, and they were covered in hair from head to toe. They didn't seem to notice us, but they were just walking about, one in front of the other, from left to right. We were interested for a while. The idea of a new species appealed to us, so we wanted to investigate. So we decided to follow them. We'd completely forgotten about the storm and our excitement, so we drove down the other side of the hill, began to tail them from the distance. It all went downhill when the snowmobile floodlight automatically turned on, because of the darkness. The creatures scattered. I guess they're averse to light. So at that point, we realized how impulsively we acted, and decided to turn around and head home. The storm was in full force by that point, and we knew we were going to have to head here, since it was the closest outpost to our location. That doesn't sound too bad, I replied, shrugging. You found a new species? Scare them off? We can check them out when the storm breaks. I'm not finished, Ray said. We wouldn't have been here much earlier, but as we were heading back, Lila looked back. She saw one of the creatures standing on top of the hills, and she pointed it out to me. We weren't more than a couple of 100 feet away from it, and through the snow, we could see something in its eyes. It had noticed us. It wasn't just some bumbling creature wandering around the tundra. It had a purpose, and we had just become it. We froze for a moment, wanting to see what it would do, and then it began to walk towards us. We drove into Sector 13 and kept heading south until it seemed like we lost the thing, and then turned back around and made our way here. Whatever it was, I don't think it just gave up on us. It's still out there, and it may be coming here. When Ray finished his story, he sat back, leaning his head against the wall, the final words being replaced by a faint ambience of the storm outside. I thought about what he'd said for a moment, and turned to Kada. Kada, can we talk in the observatory? I asked, nodding towards the other room. Of course. You two stay here, we'll be right back, she replied, and we met in the other room. Glancing back at Ray and Layla, who had begun to speak in Russian, I leaned in towards Kada and whispered, "They're clearly insane, right? People don't just go insane." Kata replied. Are you saying they actually saw Bigfoot out there? I returned. I don't know if it was the cold, the solitude or something else, but the eyes were playing tricks on them. And they were crazy enough to believe him. Ada frowned. I don't think that's the case. It is really all that outrageous to think that we've discovered a new species. An intelligent species? Listen, I have all the respect in the world for Ray, but the way he talked about making eye contact with that creature, I've heard that type of talk from two people. Hopeless romantics and deranged cultists. Before Kata could reply, Ray called out to us. Hey, Layla was wondering, have you tested out the radios? Kata raised an eyebrow. He has a point. If they were off-chasing creatures, it doesn't require too much imagination to think Abdul was too busy being nervous about something to call and one about the storm. We don't really have much proof there. Out. Well, real or not, I don't think it's a good idea to let Abdul find out about the creatures alone. He might faint, I pointed out. I looked back at Ray and Layla and said, Hold on, we'll be right there. So, what are we doing? Kata asked. I don't know. I guess we can humor them, as long as we keep them here until the storm passes. Nothing too bad can happen, right? Alright, Kata reluctantly agreed, and we re-entered the sensor room. We're pretty sure the radios are out, but that's not important right now, I informed the two. We are going to have to spend the night here anyway, so we may as well figure out what's wrong with the sensors, right? You don't think it was the creatures, Ray said. While I am not ruling it out, we need to be sure, I said, only partly lying. If we can make sure there's nothing wrong with the machinery, we'll know it was the creatures. Right. He nodded, shedding the blanket and standing up. Since Lila knows the most about it, I'll work with her on the diagnostic. Sounds good, I replied. As Russia has proposed a mission, and probably because they were the closest, they had taken care of establishing the outpost before we had arrived. While we had all been briefed on the technology we'd been using, she was the one who designed most of it. So even if I hadn't just been trying to keep their minds busy, she was the one for the job. Kata said she had been keeping an eye on them for a while, and while I told her it wasn't necessary, she said she figured it was something to do. So for a while, I sat in the observatory alone, just watching the storm. There was one spotlight on the outside of the observatory, manually operated from the inside, but it was usually switched off. It wasn't much of a sight, the dark, swirling storm, but I was lost on my thoughts, so I hadn't even realized it when something materialized in the night. It was a dark, furry shape standing out against the white snow, sparkling, but it was pretty far away. In effect, I wasn't sure it was even there. I squinted hard into the night. It was so difficult to tell one thing from another, and it seemed to shift, so I assumed I was just seeing things. But something about Ray's story irked me, so I decided to make sure, walking over to the window where the switch of the spotlight was. A shiver running through my body, I reached over to the lever that would activate the spotlight and paused, staring at the dark outline. Then I threw the lever, and the light from the bulb flooded over the dark storm, bouncing off like a blanket of white to cast a sharp reflection back at me. But the glare wasn't what caused me to stumble back. That was the result of a murky silhouette being brought into the light, and the revelation that it was exactly like the creature Ray had described. It stood over 40 feet tall, massive even in its distance from where I stood. It was covered with shaggy, matted brown fur. Not too long after I turned the light on, it slunk back to the darkness, but before it did, I got a chance to look into its eyes. What Ray said had to be right. They were the eyes of an intelligent, purposeful creature. It was thinking, considering, plotting, and I was now part of that. I had started screaming without realizing, and as a result, Kata rushed into the observatory. "What is it? What's going on?" she exclaimed, kneeling by my side. It... I stumbled, unable to articulate my sentiment, but I pointed out of the window as I scrambled to my feet. Ray was right, he was right! What? You saw it? Ray asked, following Kata into the room. It was out there in the storm. I turned on the floodlight and... It's okay, calm down, Kata said. Is it just like what they saw? I nodded. It was out there, and it knows we're in here, I told her, taking a deep breath. What happened? Where did it go? Ray asked, and looked at me for a bit after it turned the light on. Then it went away. I couldn't see where it went. We have to report back, Ray said. Let's try the radio. I have a feeling if you haven't tested it yet, it might still work. Radio who? I asked. There's an enhanced transmitter at headquarters. If we can get a message back to Abdul, he could get the word out, Ray replied. I pulled a radio from my pocket and twisted the dial, turning it to headquarters frequency. Apprehensively, I pushed a button and said, Abdul, can you hear us? This is Outpost 4. Everyone's here. We have a message. I've waited for his response for a moment, but none came. Outpost 4 to headquarters. Do you read us? I repeated, pushing the button once more. Once again, no response. I looked up at Kata. No, she whispered, putting her hand over her mouth. It already knew where we are, I said. Do you think they don't like light? That's the only reason this one's left, Ray replied grimly. Abdul wouldn't have known that. I fell to my knees, still holding the radio, eyes widening. We're alone, I murmured. Layla said something in Russian, pointing outside, and I turned around. I didn't need Ray's translation. Outside, surrounded the fringe of the spotlight's reach, were dozens of hairy creatures. It was like clearing in a forest, the way the light illuminated the clear snow, and then, just beyond it, the hairy beasts, waiting, binding their time until the power went out, at which point, well, I don't want to think about that. 20 minutes after that, Ray went crazy. We hadn't spoken since the failed mission, and we sat huddled around the observatory window, unable to take our eyes off the horde at the edge of the field of vision. He stood up, walked back into the other room. We didn't react. We hardly even noticed it, as transfixed as we were. It wasn't until he opened the hatch to the airlock and stepped through and snapped out of our trance. "Ray? What are you doing?" Kata exclaimed as she saw him leaving the outpost, but he didn't reply. He shut the door behind him and crossed the airlock, and before we could do anything, he swung open the external door, activating the lock mechanism on the side as the three of us rushed to the glass, pounding on it and pleading with him to come back. He ignored us, stepping out into the snow, and after a moment, we hear the snowmobile's engine start up, and Ray drove off into the night, our calls to return falling on deaf ears. That was the last thing to happen. We haven't spoken since then. We haven't moved since we closed the door to the observatory and sat down in the center of the sensor room. We're just waiting. The way I see it, there are two things that can happen. One, the storm miraculously breaks, morning comes, and we get as far away from here as possible. Knowing storms up here, it's not very likely. The other option is the generator runs out, a light dies, and those creatures don't have anything stopping them from getting in. The only thing left to do is wait and hope the madness that claimed Ray doesn't evade our minds. I'm writing this down in my notebook and leaving it in the outpost. If anyone is reading this, I don't really know what it means, but that's what happened at Outpost 4. Like I said, I'm still a long way from knowing why we're here. But it's probably safe to bet. Say it has something to do with those creatures. Something's going on here. I couldn't find it. I hope you can.